the VR Report podcast with David Gene O.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the VR Report, and I have a really special guest here today, Anand Das. Anand, you're going to do so much of a better job. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Happy to. Thanks for having me on, David. Hey, everybody. Anand. I work on VR and mixed reality apps at Meta, and we work with promising founders and developers who are trying to build incredible apps for things like gamified fitness and gamified education and productivity work, collaboration use cases, travel, and help them build incredible products that help the consumers understand the value of this technology and help them be set up for success and grow in the long term. Happy to be here. David, everything I'm going to talk about, I am not representing Meta. So this is just, so everything that I say is just my personal opinion.
Anand, that's awesome. Thank you for saying that. You know, you have such a rich history in the tech industry. You're like a tech OG. Can you tell us about your journey into extended reality, the XR industry, and what inspired you to focus on AR and VR applications?
Man, every time somebody calls me an OG, it's like, oh shit, yeah, people are really telling me that I'm older.
No, man, it means just respect, bro.
Let's see. I think like XR personally to me started feeling like the next thing I was looking for in a pattern that I've been looking for a really long time. So when I grew up, I mean, we didn't have computers. If you talk to people who grew up in Asia when computers were starting to happen in the early 2000s or 95, 96, it was Windows NT, Windows 97. I mean, my folks couldn't afford a computer and we didn't have computer curriculum in school. We didn't have a lab in school, right? And so the only way, when computers came along, and it was all the rage back then in 1996, 97, the only way I could access a computer was to go to these shared internet cafes. They still exist if you go to parts of Asia. You pay by the hour, you walk into mostly looking like a shady internet cafe, and you would go in and you would log in. And I remember distinctively logging into AOL and chatting with somebody in New York. I pretended like I was in New York, and they asked me like, oh, where in New York? Google wasn't a thing back then, so I couldn't search up like New York address. I just said downtown, and they were like, where in downtown? And I was like, that was the extent of the answer that I had. And so they were like, oh, you're lying to me, you're not in downtown. And then they logged out the chat session. That was literally the first experience that I ever had with the internet and the computer. And I was like, OMG, like small little kid in a podunk little town. I sat there and I was separated by distance. I was separated by time, and I managed to talk to somebody across the world. It was just like this OMG moment. I think that sort of stuck with me for a long time. And then I started working in mobile, which was sort of the next computer that emerged. And this was in the 2005, 2006. And Japan back in the day was leading the charge in mobile phones before Nokia became globally successful. And you had NTT Docomo and you had KDDI and you had these nice little flip phones. They implemented the first browser where you could like browse, you could listen to music. So I worked in consumer electronics at the chipset level, at the WAP browser, cellular modem level in Japan for a while. And then I moved to the US like about 12 years ago at this point, or 13 years ago, I forget. And I was fortunate enough to land at a time where cloud computing was starting to happen, and and mobile phones were sort of like, as everyone had the iPhone moment, right? I think Jobs talked about there's an app for that, like 2008, 9, 10, somewhere around that time frame, right? And slowly, like AWS was starting to become a thing. Google was starting to become a thing. Google Docs was sort of becoming this experience where it was a computer in the cloud. And the Chromebook was not a thing yet. And so I had the great fortune of meeting my co-founders, incredible, brilliant computer scientists. Shout out to Brett and Leon. And I was in my I probably turned 30. They were in their early 20s, just beautiful minds. And they had a vision that like mainframes, desktops, mobile phones, everything's going to get abstract that's the progression so far. It's going to get abstracted into a computer in the cloud, which is what Google Docs was started. It was a document editor in the cloud. There was Pixely, which was a photo editor in the cloud. Facebook became sort of like the place where you would post all your photos. So they were like, all your content is going to move to the cloud and you don't need a hardware. And at MIT, we used to have the system called Kerberos, where you would submit homework assignments. And so what we would do is like, you needn't lug around your computer. You would store your homework assignment flat file in a network storage somewhere on the MIT network. You would go to another computer somewhere else on the campus as you go from class to class, and you would just edit your assignments in Google Docs and you would submit it. And so Brett and Leon had this incredible vision of like, we should just make a computer in the cloud. So we started building a virtual computer in the cloud, effectively Chromebook before it was even a thing. So we built this virtual desktop. You would go to the browser, you could upload your Microsoft document files, you could edit that in a Google Doc, and you could save that to Dropbox, right? So it really didn't matter where the content lived, 3 different services, 3 different platforms. We built a sort of like virtual file system under the hood for all sorts of files. We built the super early version of Cloudflare. So we would convert all these files into URLs, and then we would add security parameters and transform parameters at the end of it. It was an incredible product, way ahead of its time. We can talk about the history of that startup if you're interested at some point. But effectively, like someday, by the way, I'll tell you about the story of not regrets really, of wrong turns in the road. We could have sold to WhatsApp before WhatsApp got bought by Meta. We did not do that. We could have, we got approached by Dropbox to sell. We didn't sell before the IPO. So a couple of turns in the road that, $1 billion turns here and there. But anyway, the idea really was and we got acquired ultimately by somebody else. We were trying to build a virtual computer. And so then I moved on from that experience, and over the next few years, messaging was starting to become the thing. You remember early days of Slack, where
100%.
everybody's like, oh, messaging is the next computer. And like, you can have bots and you can have commands, and in the flow of conversations, you can get systems to do what you want. Update a document, edit a document, file a task, file a ticket. And so I was early on in the Steam inside Meta called Workplace by Facebook, which was trying to build an enterprise communication platform where we're like, oh, it's Facebook, but at work. And you can, instead of putting photos, you can actually talk about your like product review documents. And so nobody wanted Facebook at work, and nobody wanted like Messenger and chatting at work, but we built an enterprise product and platform around it where the idea was the experiences you would want to trigger in an interaction with a computer would be messaging based. And by the way, I see that come back with OpenAI and chat and like all of that, right? Like, so messaging was kind of like, oh, that's where the next computing paradigm is. And then I saw DK1. I put it on, I puked. Like I literally puked. I just couldn't deal with it. And then I saw DK2, and there's a photo somewhere. I'll send that over to you. Like I was like, holy, what the what, right? And I was like, this is the next computer. So I tell you this long backstory because of 2 reasons. One, I am a firm believer that to look to the future, you have to look to the past, because even though things might look super disruptive and like nothing like we've ever seen before, the human mind does sense making, pattern recognition, right? I forget which book this was. I'll remember this at some point, but it's a book about epistemology, which is how knowledge gets created, shared, and born. And the thesis is pretty simple. Like you have a hypothesis, you introspect it, and you ask questions about it, and you compare it to patterns and new knowledge is born, right? That's how sort of the progression of knowledge in human society happens. And I think as people who work in technology, we tend to make sense by looking at the past. And so for me, this was an evolution, step by step by step, of where the computing paradigm is going. And eventually you won't even need the hardware. It'll become implantables, but I don't think that's sort of anytime in my lifetime. So there you go.
Well,
that's how I sort of ended up in XR.
That's fantastic. What a fascinating background. Thanks for sharing about your humble beginnings as well, and being able to take your trip to MIT, focusing on startups, creating your own startup, partnering with some smart people at MIT. You didn't mention Postmates, which was also something that you were a big part of, which was a kind of a revolutionary way of delivering food, like on demand service. So I think you have a very wide spectrum of seeing technology grow and seeing
We
that
didn't talk
DK.
about that.
Yeah,
Sorry, we didn't
yeah.
talk
Let's
about
talk
that.
about it.
I mean, we don't have to get into it. Someday I'll tell you about all the entire story about like on-demand delivery wars, which was another sort of consumer platform wars between like Uber, Postmates, DoorDash, Grubhub. It was a marketplace business, and I guess like for me the draw there was the just like computing was sort of like getting unbundled, so to speak, right? It got unbundled into the internet. And now we're actually seeing rebundling back into consumer hardware with like AR and VR, where like it's a platform, right? Consumer experiences were unbundling too, and marketplaces were becoming a thing where you could connect buyers and sellers. eBay already became a thing. Anyway, for me, it was like super fascinating because it was sort of the same paradigm. There's something about the infrastructure, about how we interact that is atomizing and fragmenting. And so I had the good fortune of working with yet another incredible visionary founder, Bastian. I was at the exec team at Postmates and led the E round, few $100 million raised. It was an incredible story. And it was a time when Travis Kalanick and Uber were like full on war mode.
That's
Amazing.
right.
Amazing. It was great to
Yeah.
watch. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I was like, it's a little detour, so I'm not going
No,
into it.
that's actually what I wanted to know. I think the audience would really find that interesting as well, because, that really did revolutionize the way that we even get things delivered. And that was such a crazy, tumultuous time. I remember Sebastian because he had just raised a seed round and I was helping a company called Vungle. They did mobile advertising that also made a exit a couple of years ago. The founders are really two of my best friends still today. And Sebastian would just give us free credit. So we would use it just to order like sodas from someplace and bring them to the office. And I
Yeah.
think that evolution with technology of your experience with the DK1, you've seen XR now rapidly evolve, right, as a field. What recent developments and trends do you see that have really caught your attention? And how do you see that shaping the industry itself?
Great question. I would sort of draw the technology on one axis and the consumer value on the other axis, right? And on one end of the spectrum, having tracked DK2, Rift, Quest 1, Quest 2, Quest 3 Pro, and we worked together a little bit during those days when it was, around the Quest Pro pre-launch moments and stuff. I think on one end of the spectrum, you have full immersion and virtual reality. On the other end of the spectrum, you have full-on world-locked, dynamically updated augmented reality. On that spectrum, in this x-axis, I think the biggest shift that I don't think even we, as people working in the medium and the format, have grokked is the shift to full-on mixed reality. That to me is a significant bump and a shift. I know Carmack disagrees based on what he said, and we can talk about that. I think that's one of the single biggest shifts that I have seen in the technology. On the consumer, there's all the other stuff, right? Like pancake optics, so things is lighter, battery life gets better. Like, I mean, all that stuff is there, but to me, like, I put the Pro, I actually put Quest 2 on my wife, and she didn't take to it. There is obviously double tap pass through on Quest 2, but it's all grainy, right? I gave her the Quest 3 and she literally didn't need anything. Like she put it on, she did head strap adjustment, and she's like, "Oh, cool! Like I can see my hands, right?" And then she started like poking the touchscreen. Like so, it's a very natural model for the people who are in the part of the adoption curve that is beyond the chasm, and we can talk about crossing the chasm whenever, maybe if it's relevant. But I think it's such a meaningful step increase for people. So that's like one. Consumer value is an entirely different thing. It really has to be an intersection set of the two. And I think if you sort of like think about value as a spectrum, and kind of the proxy for value that I think about is like, why would you and when would you use or hire XR relative to a computer or a phone? Right? There's a part of this which is like, it needs to be so much better that feel compelled to do it. And I think there's that Rubicon that we need to cross, which we haven't crossed as an industry yet. We are starting to cross that Rubicon in consumer value on like specific things like games, right? Like gamers are starting to, I mean, they're always sort of the early adopters of everything. And even then, if you look at like generally commentary in on Reddit and Discord and stuff, like, I want to play my PC VR games. There's still like this gravity well of PC games and billions of dollars and thousands of hundreds of thousands of titles and genres and subgenres and sub-subgenres that like gamers are starting to get into VR and MR. There's that starting to cross at Rubicon. If I would put this on relative to my D-pad in my hand in my living room, but not always, right? If I want to have a gaming session with my kid, like, I mean, my Nintendo's there and we're having like a gaming session on a flat TV, right? So I think value Rubicon, I think we're seeing good signals around health, whether that is like physical fitness, mental wellness, sports and sports training. There's incredible companies, especially the business models, the value proposition that is so strong for the consumer that it will beat the alternative substitute. Like, um, I'm personally a big fan of things that look like things we've never seen before. Like, I was very surprised when I saw, for example, Wind Realty for the first time, just baseball training. Not many consumers know it, parents don't know it, but a lot of their consumers are school kids, high school kids, parents of high school kids, so definitely over 13 years of age, coaches in local communities, because if you're a parent, you'll know driving your kid from training clinic to games to session is hard. Coaches are not always available. So parents who are serious about their kids playing baseball and softball are buying these headsets. Coaches are recommending to them because kids can train at home, right? It's not a classic consumer sexy use case that people talk about, but like there, it's the cost of driving, it's the time to drive, it's the availability of coaches, it's the cost of session. Like there's real value being generated in some of these cases. I think there's like parts of fitness where you're starting to see that. And then you keep going above the stack. So to your question, like, where are we in the spectrum? Ideally, we want to be in the top right quadrant, right? Fully world locked, incredible, dynamically updated content, and all use cases are so awesome that you would increasingly you start using XR. I think we're like the very beginning of that journey, and this is like I think this is a 10, 20, it's a multi-decade journey that'll ultimately get us to where we are. And people mistake, like, I think humans overreact. Nothing is as great as it seems. Nothing is as bad as it seems. I think we quickly, this is why Gabriel and I talk about in our podcast. We want to talk more about XR and stuff. And we started with like navigating the hype. I think you have to be in this for the long term. And those of us who looked at this for a while know that there's like hype come, hype goes, tourists come, tourists go. But like sort of the cockroach founders and the cockroach startups and believers stay. So it's very much the ecosystem is still missionary, not mercenary. So that's a long non-answer to your question of like, where is the future going? Like, I don't think it's one thing. You have to work on both of these axes, and over time. And I also think it's a fallacy to say that XR will replace other computers. We've had PCs since 1990 at least, and it's 2023. 30 years of the personal computer, 20 years of the mobile phone, they coexist for different jobs. And I think XR will also be the same. And I hire my Meta Ray-Ban sunglasses for a different job that I hire even like my Quest 3, right? So these will coexist, and I don't think it's ever going to be like this. Everything switches over, and it's like I walk. It's not Minority Report anytime soon, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I couldn't agree more. And I think you painted a beautiful picture where you did answer the question regarding what are the trends, because mixed reality, I think that's just really the beginning, the Pandora's box. I call it like hobby training when you're using mixed reality, like to learn the piano for piano vision. You get into state of flow of doing something very leisurely, but at the same time learning something, which gets you into that flow state. I also advise for XR Bootcamp. We do training for XR. One of the students had created a mixed reality experience foraging for mushrooms, right? Something that you would think like, wow, that's really out there, but it kind of makes sense for that niche audience. And of course, there's this really awesome application called Paradiddle, which has been kind of blowing up on Reddit, where they actually used real drums that they can map with mixed reality to now play with the real drums and get trained. And I think I call it hobby training, where people are actually doing things that they love and using mixed reality to augment that experience to make it better than you can working with a physical teacher.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I quickly react to that?
Yeah, please.
I think that the meta pattern that you're pointing to, sorry, you'll always see me go back to like patterns and like P. Markov talked about software eating the world, right? And bits and atoms and digitization, what at this point, like 6 years ago. That is a great example of that happening in XR. You couldn't do that with computers and phones. Yes, you did. I remember this piano app, Flowkey, which I got to learn piano on my iPad, but it's not the same thing. And then you have Piano Vision coming along, where you have Air Piano and even like augmented information lying overlaid on top of real piano. And like Zach, the founder, solo founder,
Incredible,
passionate about piano,
badass.
he and his mom like wanted to like play piano together, and this one incredible individual invented the whole goddamn thing. And I think Paddle is a similar story too with Emre. Like, but the idea really is like, I mean, you see a drum set in the background. Like,
Yeah.
like I think the OG, you know who the OG in this one is? Tribe XR. Tom and team at Tribe.
DJing.
$3,000 DJ professional equipment is now all digital, and they actually work. The turntables and the knobs and all that stuff work. So like, I think you are pointing to the meta pattern of like expensive, hard to get things that cannot be well represented on a flat surface is prime for XRification. And that's one where the value Rubicon will be crossed. If you take our little X and Y axis and draw a Z and say like the volume of the install base, right? That is its own like thing. Are there going to be a billion piano players? No. Will piano alone make will like Piano Vision like experience alone make XR jump the shark and mainstream? No. But you have to collect these niches, right? You collect the piano players, you collect the DJs, the drum players, and this is like quite well known at this point in the community, which is like anything serious starts off as a toy. You collect these toys. You put these toys together, and over decades of work, it'll actually become a thing that everyone believes it's going to become. So
I love that analogy. I mean, I think, that's something that you've really discussed heavily on your podcast with Gabriel. In one of your podcast episodes of Reality Shift, people should check that out. You and Gabriel talk about navigating through the hype. Can you elaborate on that topic, considering what hype is in this industry and what that means?
Sorry, I think we went on a little bit of a rant in that on that podcast. Obviously, there's like sort of a hype cycle that everybody knows about. What we believe is it's never sort of a one and done hype cycle. You have micro and you have macro cycles, right? And Felix Hartman at Hartman Capital, I watched him present this in the context of his hedge fund work. And he's like, hey, there's like microcycles. A cycle ends and a new cycle begins. And when you layer these cycles on together, you get this like upward S curve. And so anything that seems like a hype in the moment is actually connected to a set of things in the long term. And if you work with data, you've seen this, like when you zoom out far enough, the curve is smoothed. And it's either up and to the right or down into the right, depending on what the data phenomenon is. And then when you zoom really in on a daily basis, it's noisy, super noisy. And I think like hype cycles are a representation of that in action when humans copy each other and get mimetic. There's mimetic theory that states like humans learn by copying. And so if you find something and you talk about it and I desire it and I would talk about it too, and then it just catches fire. And in a good world, sorry, not in a good world. In a good way, it's like word of mouth that positively drives these flywheels. Hype is sort of the inverse. I think it's like it's sort of good, but it's super damaging. And XR has gone through a lot of its hype cycles, right? Like when Oculus got bought was one peak of hype cycle, and then there was a die off. There's so many founders that left the industry, and I think like Apple's entry and all of that is sort of like another hype moment. It's really good for the industry because it sort of like builds an install base for developers to build incredible experiences on. But I really worry about what I call like tourists,
Hmm.
tourist VCs and tourist founders, because they fill the space with a narrative that, oh, it's not ready yet. It's too early for us. And that's really damaging for a lot of incredible founders because what everyone's saying is like, it's an X computer. Like, do you know how long it took to build a computer? And do you know how long XR has taken from the first time someone tried to build a Sword of Damocles? It's like, at this point, 60 years. Anything worth doing takes a really long time. And like, especially investors have to just be really patient. I am super bullish that this is inevitable. And so Gabriel and I talk about just be careful and I try to understand the underlying phenomenon of what is driving progress. If you actually go in there and you look at the specifics, you'll actually start noticing things. I mean, just at like Connect, right? There was this talk about with Quest 3, there was talk about scene mesh, depth, and there was one more thing. Like what that essentially it sounds like you don't know what it is.
Well, I was just going to bring up now we're going to be able to have body tracking, which is going to be phenomenal because that's going to complete the circle. But please go ahead.
No, I was gonna say like, yeah, things like that, right? Like you've digitized the world around you with better understanding. And people don't realize that that foundational change has happened.
Right.
That is no longer you can understand the entire scene mesh. It's still early, right? Like, but you can understand parts of your world and do better occlusion with depth API and stuff. There's things like this that weren't just fundamentally possible. Like that's I think inside mixed reality, a very specific thing that is world changing that people haven't like realized, which is a foundational technology piece for like augmented reality. You need to understand the world. Now we have a completely different problem with augmented reality where like battery life and display and waveguide optics need to, it's like chemistry problems and physics problems to make world sensing and then make it like world locked, which means you're constantly telling these pair of like AR glasses, like, hey, you moved 30 feet and like the billboard is 30 feet behind now. It's like world locked and you have to feed that constant information. You have like physics and chemistry problems with things like that. But I think the specific thing around like depth and occlusion is a good example of something in a confined space as a foundational piece. I don't know how we ended up in this conversation, but
No, but this is great because what you're really describing is what people always have debates on, which is really the definition of the metaverse. What you're saying, hey, it's a single shared, immersive but persistent experience, right? But in 3D, because it's the next paradigm of computing. And what people don't understand is I think conceptually we are in the metaverse because we're around screens, around digital content. What's missing is that one extra dimension where it's 3-dimensional. And to your point, when we understand the real world around us digitally, it's persistent. It's on all the time. There's lock where if I come back to that experience, it's there. Those 3D models or holograms that I interacted with are going to be there when I return. So I think, is that also something that you share in terms of the same definition of the metaverse?
really a contrarian view here.
I want to hear it.
I think the metaverse is like trying to describe to us, just grab somebody from the 1900s and try to explain to them about the internet. They'd be like, what? What do you mean bits and atoms and network computers? And like, at some point I'll publish this. I've been putting away clips of these little things over
I
time.
love it.
One day when I'm old and cranky, I'll be like, look at this. But like, I have an accumulation of like all the things people got wrong about computing and the internet, including the smartest individuals who are technologists, like Bill Gates and others, and economists and opinion leaders like the press about the computer and the internet. And this famous thing, right? Oh, there's a market of 100 computers at best. And like 3.5 billion phones on the planet right now, or something much larger. So I think the metaverse is like that. It will not be. It will be what we think it will be, and then some, and then completely different from what we imagined it to be. I don't even go there at all because like that is a great North Star vision, and this persistent world and holograms and interactivity and all that stuff. We'll get there at some point. This is like Star Trek. Remember the telecorder? I
Yeah.
forget what the thing was called. Like they are now basically cell phones. We haven't got the beam me up, Scotty, yet. At some point we will. But to me, it's like imagine the technology being called like is that a part of metaverse? You digitized, right?
Mm.
So I don't think it's such a big concept that it's really hard to like even for my little mind to understand what it is. Instead, like I think what I tend to focus on is like every bit of information that has a 3D representation that is more useful to you than not having that information or more useful to you than having it in a flat surface because now you finally have the technologies to make it three-dimensional, make it live on top of things that never lived before, like the piano vision example, and have it stay there consistently. Those specific things of value in the short term is what, like, as this technology progresses from right innovators, early adopters, early majority, late as you go through sort of the crossing the chasm, like we have to start. The one thing we as like people in XR need to worry a lot more about than the talking heads and the people who have opinion columns and claim to invest but never invest in XR. This idea of like the metaverse in its full instantiation will obviously appeal all the way to the laggards, but that's like a long time away. And I think for the metaverse to even become a thing, you need to like figure out what is this specific set of value points that a consumer will get if you're trying to talk to an early adopter or even early majority, right? I'm kind of like pushing back on the idea of talking about the metaverse way too much because
That is the
people,
North Star.
it's a North Star, but we got to get our heads down and keep building and building and building. And anytime somebody talks about the metaverse, I'd be like, I don't know what it's going to be. It is definitely going to be a thing, but it won't be anything like we knew. Can we just focus on something we can deliver uniquely valuable to the user like right now,
Mm.
right? Because that's how founders get funded. You have to have a 10x product. You need to have a business on top of that product. Like all of this technology, for technology's sake, is like really good, but at the end of the day, it has to pay the bills of the developers. So kind of like go back to the foundational thing. Like what can we build that'll actually get a consumer to pay or use enough for a founder to keep building?
That's beautiful. I think your analogy of the metaverse, it is a North Star. We're not there yet. I have a differing view. Conceptually, I think we're there just like we have hoverboards today with electric scooters, but we can differ on that. We can agree to disagree. But you did mention something very interesting in terms of navigating through the hype. That's really a perception. But in terms of perspective, you also mentioned, George Moore's concept, his book called Crossing the Chasm. It's basically a related concept in terms of innovation adoption. And basically, how it works is that there's kind of like this curve, this S curve, that bump that goes up and goes down, where it starts with innovators adopting a product. They're the visionaries. They're looking even for the minimum feature set. They're coming on board, right? And then there's this chasm of where it jumps to the early majority. And those are the people that are going to jump in when the features are pretty much set and secure. And then you get to the late majority, people who come in late into the game, but then you're hitting mainstream numbers, and then you got the laggards, and then it goes down again. That's the concept of crossing the chasm of what you explained. When do you think for XR we're going to get to that level? Right? Yeah, no, it's funny because how can you predict this? But what is your prediction of being able to cross that chasm of where we are with XR today?
If I could predict the future, I would retire. Um, that's a really hard one. The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is more nuanced. The long answer is more nuanced because I think we're in the phase of exponential growth where the exponential multiplication is happening, but we don't perceive it. And Peter Diamond just talks a lot about this of like exponential thinking. Humans are linear thinker and not exponential thinkers, right? We want to see everything constantly linearly go up. And you can run this experiment if you have a spouse or if you have a younger family member, like a kid or a nephew or niece, ask them the question, hey, Johnny, I'll give you $1 a day for the next 30 days? Do you want $1 a day for the next 30 days? Or I'll give you a cent today. I'll give you 2 cents tomorrow. I'll give you 4 cents the next day, and do the geometric like compounding effect. Johnny, you look at it and say like 1 cent, I can't do anything the first day. 2 cents, I can't do anything the first day. 4 cents, I can't. At some point, I think the answer is like the 26th day or something, or 24th day, suddenly it turns into $1 million. And then the 27th day, it turns into like something much more, like whatever the math works out to be in terms of compounding effects. I think that's where we are in XR. The people who are trying to make, the people who are inside the soldering the boards, writing the function calls, trying to like debug the code, they're all seeing parts of the compounding effects bit by bit by bit. People outside are like, hey, this isn't going up in the right path enough. Like, let's go. Oh, the metaverse is dead. VR, that's still for nerds. And this is why I think, and like the fact that there are many large tech companies now starting to do what Meta has been pushing for a long, long time is a good, because it gives people a belief and an anchoring idea while this compounding silently happens. Like, oh, look, there's rumors of this company doing that headset. Oh, look, that's coming out next year. Like, great. Please believe that. Please continue to like invest in founders who are working on the compounding. But I think it's just like silent compounding slowly happening. And one day we're going to wake up and we're like, right? This is what happened to the mobile phones. Nokia was around for such a long time. They had sort of the first crack at a smartphone with the Symbian operating system, but it was weird stuff around how Symbian was set up as sort of like a corporation separate from Nokia, whatever. Like, and then Apple happened. Would you have imagined like Google ever happening after Apple dominated? Google came to the market. Android happened after like Apple happened, right? Like, and now there's like billions of like Android devices.
There's more Android devices than Apple. Yeah, 100%.
Right. And so like the compounding effect is what's happening. I think there's like a few things for this to hit scale. There's obviously the known and obvious things of like, hey, it needs to get lighter, more socially acceptable, so on and so forth. And I think also like affordable devices matter quite a bit. Like matters quite a bit. I think this is why like I find it fascinating that devices that are 10x better are shipping at almost the same price. Like Quest 3 and Quest 2, the bump in everything is so much higher. The bump in price is not like 10 times more, right? I think you'll start seeing this pattern a lot more. So to me, like for that to cross the chasm, it's a multivariate problem. The technologists will continue to build technology. The job for founders and like folks like us is to build the value, consumer value on top of the use cases bit by bit by bit and figure out a way to reach these people. Like, I bet you the Piano Teachers Association of America do not know about Piano Vision. They will either freak out because now you no longer need your expensive Steinway pianos.
That's exactly what, yeah.
Or they might be like, oh my God, what do I do? But you know what the reality is? If you become the world's best, if you're Yuja Wang, she's an incredible pianist, you want your Steinway. But right now, the next Yuja Wang is a 14-year-old kid whose mom is dragging her to piano classes, and half the time, like, she's exhausted. And half the time, like, the teacher is like teaching 20, 30 kids. And like, it's moments like that where this technology really starts like shining. I think our job is to add the consumer value and then make these devices very, 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 very affordable. And it's easy to talk about this. It's really hard to do because you're fighting against the inertia of like, why can I not, like, even working out, right? Like, I run, I lift weights, and I work out in headset. That's sort of my like routine, and I do that in a cyclical fashion, which means I'm working out in headset only like twice a week. And it's a competition between like running outside in the beautiful sun. Winter is coming. I mean, like literally, autumn is here, at least in part of the world that I live in, and running gets colder and harder. So I'm going to be more in headset. So like, it's a fight for like share of mind and share of time every single day, and habit building, which will take time. So those things need to come into play before it'll actually tip over. But I think we're in a compounding phase.
I really appreciate how you rendered that example of compounding effect in terms of crossing that chasm. I think crossing the chasm for me is when I believe there was a Deloitte report. I think we're at like 22 million headsets that are being actively used today. When we get to Switch numbers where it's like 129 million, that's definitely the laggard situation. So it's between that, the 22 million and the 129 million is when we do cross the chasm in terms of that innovation adoption. But going back to your perspective on technology, you also invest heavily in a lot of startups. And in terms of XR startups, you've seen a lot of them today. A lot of these startups are trying to be known or at least get noticed in this competitive landscape. What advice do you have for these XR startups looking to just succeed and to break away?
Great question. I should just clarify. I personally don't invest when I have conflict of interest. I cannot. So I don't personally invest in startups in the XR space. In trying to bring content to the Quest platform, we do work with a lot of founders. That's sort of what my day job is. I only invest when it's like nothing to do with XR really personally, because I can't have conflict of interest.
Makes
so just
sense.
Clarifying that like straight off the bat, like I think a few fundamentals are important. I mean, if I were doing an XR startup now, the first thing I would do is like community, right? I think we're all predisposed to thinking tech and building technical like products. I think we fall too much in love with what we're building and not enough in love with the community we're building it for. So my single biggest thing would be like community, 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 community. There are millions of people outside XR than inside XR. You have to get them to see the promised land. And have you seen this video at a music festival where there's this person who's dancing, right? And everybody's sitting in the park. It's a music festival. Have you seen this video I'm talking about?
Yeah, the virality of that one person getting that other one person. I love this analogy.
The second person.
The second person. Yeah, exactly. One other person outside yourself. Yeah.
The first person is here for XR, for whatever you're trying to build, right? If you're trying to build a meditation app, there's somebody for whom there is like fear of going to social settings and they're trying to calm themselves before the first person is here. I'm going to call this person the first person shooter game. That's what you're playing. The first person shooter is like here.
Yeah.
You need a second person, right? And every time I've seen a successful thing, it's because the founder intrinsically invested in community. Go look at like what Gym Class is doing. Incredible work building the community. Go look at what Tribe is doing. Go look at like what Troop is doing. It's because the founders are doing it for the love and the joy of the community that their product is designed to serve. And tactically, what that looks like is like curating that community into Discord groups, being where they are on Reddit, talking to them, getting feedback from them, making them creators on the product, collaborators on the product. I think that will yield the tipping point function for that specific use case. So community is sort of like the big under leveraged thing. The second thing is like when I think the venture capital world is pretty interesting right now after the zero interest rate policy ended. Obviously, like VCs can put their capital in a bank and get like 5.5%, whatever the number is. And VCs by nature, since they look at like 10x returns like immediately, most venture capitalists would be like, yeah, we're long-term investors, we're long-term thinkers. I think when I hear that, it's like, what's the definition of long-term? And the answer is like, oh, our fund cycle is like 8 to 10 years. Cool. When do you need to show your first like signals of success to your LP? Oh, about 3 to 4 years into the first fund, we start raising for the next fund. So effectively, they're tunnel vision into a 4-year window. And what they're looking for a 4-year window is things like an Instacart, a Coinbase, what else? Like whatever else came along in
any of the unicorns that came
NFT, out like Anthropic, like
right.
Because they're ultimately selling to their LPs. And they can't go in and keep selling them vision of the metaverse. They literally want to be able to say, like, that thing is worth $10 billion in 4 years, and I invested a check at a low valuation, so my multiple is 99x, right? Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because, like, there is a real gap in frontier tech work that a lot of founders are doing versus like where the venture capital industry is today. So when you go to VCs, you have to be very surgical in who you identify because many will waste your time. And that's the one thing that founders don't have. And when having those conversations, you have to be like, you have to sell obviously the long term, but anchor back on the short term. Hey, look at my community. Look at the engagement. Look at the retention. Look at the like Instagram reels, TikTok videos. Like you want to show them that the toy is actually a runaway toy starting to happen within the people who care about the toy. And I think that is sort of the missing link between the promise of XR and the metaverse, which everyone buys into as investors, and where the founders' current state of progress is. And so I think that to me like matters quite a bit to help these help like founders be successful with investors. So those are two pieces of, I think, call it advice, I guess, but it's what I would do if I were like out there raising money and building an XR company as a founder.
Yeah, I love those two things. Things around like the Web3 space. Building community is forefront because you really have a belief in the product for the future. And they really have to hone in on that community to keep that engine going. So yeah, for communities to build from, developers need to focus on community. I think that's the bottom line. I love that. I'm glad you didn't mention something like, oh, look at founders and their experience. I think that's a softball one. We talked about piano vision, where I call it hobby training, but education, I think, is also the next forefront of adoption for XR. I got introduced to this founder, Laura Gonzalez, who is really focusing on the microverse, where she's taking biological and healthcare data and visualizing it for people. So she's doing some trials with some healthcare companies. And that whole idea of microverse versus the metaverse, I think, is really interesting. What other aspects of education do you think are opportunities for people who are thinking about startups in this space?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because all new technologies mostly start with like younger people inventing the future for the rest of us. Children, like basically young adults, right? People in like high school and colleges, they basically set the. I just said children, and I realized like, oh my God, I'm 40 something, and I've started calling young adults children. Like, oh God, okay.
Happens to me every other day.
Oh my goodness, okay. So like essentially young adults and teens set the norms for the society broadly, right? This is a known thing. It's not like, and I think they will adopt technology faster than we can teach them how to adopt technology. And there's so much time being spent learning, and all of it is still stuck in ineffective methods. That I am a firm believer, even with like the X and Y axis we started the conversation with, like technology and consumer value. And like education is one of those things where the value is obvious. Cannot explode dangerous substances in the lab. Cannot dissect the human body every other day. Cannot, even if you wanted to and you could afford to, there is no technology possible to get into, as you call it, the microverse inside the body. Just doesn't exist. Will never exist for a long time till we figure out how to like shrink the kids, right? So like I think education will be one that is going to be really, really transformed with all the technologies that we talked about today. There's I think broadly two classes of like things. There's like kind of gamified education, right? Like it's not. I mean, if you grew up in the U.S., you probably learned and if you lived in sort of the West Coast, you probably learned about Oregon Trail and you used Oregon Trail to learn about history. My kid I know like does scratch programming and understands like block and code based programming through like we put him in after school programs over the summer, like around like Minecraft for education, Roblox for education. So like there's like this gamified education world. In the 2D, there's like Prodigy, phenomenal math game on like on a web browser. So like if you have children, you're trying to get them to do more math, go check out Prodigy. Everybody knows about Duolingo, right? My brother-in-law is teaching my kid a new language which we need him to learn because he doesn't speak anything other than English, using Duolingo, and he's like halfway across the world, and he's like, "What's your streak today?" And like, "Have you done this?" Like, so like, there's like a whole notion of like gamified education, and there's like pedagogical science, STEM-based education, or like language learning. Like that's like formal curriculum, right? History, science, math, biology, that kind of stuff. Prisms by Anurupa is a very, very good example of math education using XR, doing incredibly great work. We did randomized control trials in my day job with Prisms because we work very closely with them. And the learning efficacy is like off the charts. For example, remember we talked about like exponential thinking and like compounding effects?
Right.
That effectively is like the exponent in an equation, right? And when students learned about exponential functions in prisms by simulating, I'm going to change the exponent from like 2 to like 8, what happens? To see particles expand in your real space and see what that looks like is so much more kinesthetically impactful than like trying to explain something. Hey, it's a curve on a screen. Look, it's flat. It's look flat. Oh, and the 26th day increases. And they're like, cool, 26th day. When is like break? When am I going to recess? Right? Whereas when you put them in the headset and you're trying to explain the stuff to them and they're modeling and simulating, like it just sticks because all senses are being like used. So prisms, you should go check out. There's things like that, which is formal education. I think the job that we have collectively across education is to make the business model work. When internet happened, everybody thought about this too, like education. Here we are 20 years later. Why isn't there a vibrant billions and billions dollars worth of an education industry? There's tens of millions, there's hundreds of millions. Most of it is like school and education policy funded, like core curriculum stuff or college stuff. But you don't talk about education in the same context as you talk about consumer social or
Totally.
Internet 2.0, right?
I never thought
So
about that.
I think we have a job to be done here with XR of how to make the business model work. It matters quite a bit for the longevity and the vibrancy of the ecosystem over the long term.
That's fascinating. You really crystallized that for me. I know you have to go, but I have one more question for you. We already talked about predictions, and I know how you feel about that. But in terms of advice for individuals who are passionate about XR, maybe they're switching careers, or they're just really in love, enamored with the technology. What makes meaningful impact in this field as developers and entrepreneurs? What advice can you give them?
It's the advice that I would give anybody starting any kind of startup, regardless of whether it's XR or not. The ultimate goal is to build something that people need and will pay for, either directly or indirectly. VG, Paul Graham talked about this many years ago. We're like, the best way to start a startup is to not to start a startup. Because you end up, like, especially the ideas that you have look good. Smart people have a way of convincing themselves that this is a thing, right? And then the worst thing is to work on a thing that's not a thing, but you believe it's a thing. And you did it because you wanted to, your first purpose was to make a thing, right? That I think is a wrong starting point. Like only do an XR thing or an Internet 2.0 or a crypto or whatever thing, AI thing, if there is a thing that needs to exist that you personally are so bugged about. Like as I grow older, the things that are starting to bug me a lot more around health, education, old age, especially like if you have parents, they worry me quite a bit. A startup is a way for me to go solve a problem that is a very specific problem within those 3 buckets of things. But that might not be the case for everybody, right? Like if you're a D1 to D4 athlete, you've decided you're not going to go become a professional athlete once you graduate from school, but have been so bugged about the things that you want to do for sports training. This technology is a means to that end. It's a vessel, right? That's what Win Realty did. That's what it's a game. It's called NFL Pro Era.
Love Pro Era.
And the founders there are former NFL players, right? Like you have to like find a thing that bugs you enough that you want to do something about it. And the better way to do something about it is to actually build it. Then you do a startup. Otherwise, don't do it. So don't do unless you absolutely need to do. And if you absolutely need to do, then my second advice is like build to last, right? it's an 8 to 10 year journey. Someday if we need to, we can talk about this. I had the good fortune or luck of being in the same YC cohort as like Brian at Coinbase and Apurva at Instacart. I've seen those guys.
Oh, dude, we gotta have another episode.
Like normal dudes with an abnormal obsession about something that no one understood. Those are like outliers and anomalies of outcomes. Assume it'll take like what Instacart took 10 years before they could like IPO. Coinbase a little faster. And they're the 1% that survived, the 99% like did not survive. So survive. Build to last, stay. Don't optimize for the hype. You'll have to play the game a little bit with VCs to like make sure that you have enough capital running, because number one job of founder is not run out of money. But be a cockroach founder. The score will take care of itself. You will either succeed or you will fail. But if you obsess over it and try to optimize for it, like you're not going to be able to get there at all. This is why I have immense respect for cockroach founders in the XR space. People who've been at it for 6, 7, 8 years. Hats off. Like those are the people we need to protect, preserve, support, and help. Like all the founders we talked about. I mean, between Nanea at Trip and like Inga at Shapes, and like I can go on and on and on and on about these founders who've been at it for their lives as their life's work for 6, 7, 8 years. You want to be like them. So if you're not ready to do that, don't do it. But if you're going to do it, so step 1, do you absolutely do it? If yes, do it. If you plan to do it, step 2, plan to stay for 10 years, 8 to 10 years. That's what it's going to take. Step 3, surround yourself with like mentors and allies. The hard thing about mentors and allies is nobody has time. And so one of the mistakes I see people do when they start off is like, hey, can we get on a call? Like that's not going to happen. Tap into they want to help, but tap into their ability to help asynchronously. Like, hey, I'm thinking about a very specific problem. I'm like trying to build this thing sitting somewhere in some part of the world. Like, should I do this or should I do that? How should I think about it? You probably get faster responses through like emails and messages than trying to get on a call, because everyone wants to help. And so I'd say like surround yourself with allies, but be smart about how you leverage those mentors and allies.
Oh no, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, and we'll have to do another one.
The Battle Scars episode, how I almost sold to WhatsApp and Dropbox, but I did not. And
I want to hear that
Scars
story.
Episode of like Uber versus Postmates, and the Battle Scar episodes of like IC founders who were working on things that look like bad ideas but were actually incredible ideas.
Right.
We could package all the contrarian into like.
I see a book. I
don't know, man. Look, yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, man. Great to be here.